In the last video, I concluded my explanation of ancient history in Southeast Asia, and then we covered medieval history. And I explained that the medieval history of Southeast Asia can be divided into a couple of different segments. The first is the period of dominance of the Srivijaya kingdom in Indonesia. Then second, we see the emergence of the influence of Islam becoming an important factor in the history of this region. And then third, the influence of China and these Chinese voyages of influence as the Chinese attempt to establish a trading network in or through Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean. These voyages are voyages designed to show Chinese power and establish Chinese influence. But around 1450, they come to an end, and instead, new Chinese dynasty chooses to take a more introverted, a more isolationist approach. And so these voyages come to an end. Now we come to the early modern period of Southeast Asian history, and this is a period that's dominated by European interaction and colonization. Now we're told that Marco Polo is one of the first Europeans to visit Southeast Asia, and he does so in the service of the Mongol Khan in the 13th century. That said, regular European interactions with Southeast Asia, which is one of the most remote parts of the world from Europe, don't really begin until the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century. And we talked about this period when we talked about Indian history and the early modern history of India. The Portuguese are going to create a trading empire in the Indian Ocean based on creating forts and influencing the rulers in specific strategic points. And one of those points is the region of Malacca, which had become, under the Sultanate of Malacca, the most influential city in terms of politics and in terms of trade and economy in the region. In 1511, the Portuguese conquer Malacca. They now control this strait, and with it access between the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean and India. So this is a focal point, a really important control point in Indian influence and control over, in European influence and control over Southeast Asia. The Portuguese soon are outpaced by the Netherlands and Spain, who dramatically expand their influence in this region as we enter into the 16th century, and into the 17th century. In 1599, the Spanish begin to colonize the Philippines, which are named after the Spanish King Philip. And in 1619, the Dutch establish a base of trade for themselves on the island of Java. And the Dutch soon become the most prominent power in the region. This again was something we discussed when we looked at our history of India. In the 17th century, the Dutch become the most important and the most powerful trading and naval empire nation in the world. And in 1641, they capture Malacca from the Portuguese. They now control this strategic point. They are the leading influence, the leading European influence in Southeast Asia. Also, for a period in the 18th century, we see a re-emergence of Chinese influence. What's interesting about this re-emergence is that the Chinese established the first republic in Southeast Asian history. It's a republic that is a tributary of their empire, but it itself is conquered by the Dutch in 1884. So even as late as the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, when the British Empire was increasingly powerful, was the most powerful empire in the world, the Dutch are still highly influential in Southeast Asia. Now, what's the story of British involvement in Southeast Asia? Again, we studied this a little bit in our survey of Indian history. The British start to get involved in Southeast Asia along with the Dutch, but are driven out of Southeast Asia as the Dutch become more powerful, and so they turn their attention instead to India. And they're establishing themselves in India, but in 1786 they start to establish military bases, beginning with Penang Island, in the Southeast Asian area in their 18th and 19th century wars against the French. In the 19th century, the British begin to expand their influence in Southeast Asia. This is also something that we touched on briefly in our history of India. First, we see the establishment of Singapore as a trading post in 1819 by a man named Stamford Raffles. Here's an image a statue of him that stands in Singapore today. He is the first to establish Singapore as a major trading location. And this is the new British foothold, the new foothold of British influence in the Southeast Asian region. In 1824, the English and the Dutch agree a treaty, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, which establishes that British influence will be restricted to the mainland, Dutch influence will be restricted to the islands. And shortly after that, in the 2 years after that, we see the British conquest of Burma. And the British extend their rule in the Indian subcontinent to the region of Burma, which is this region that's in pink here. And this marks the expansion of British influence in Southeast Asia, the beginnings of British conquest in this region. And this is with the Sepoy army that we talked about when we discussed the history of India. This army that's made up a lot of Indians who are fighting for the British Empire and have established one of the most powerful armies in Asia at the time. American involvement, we haven't talked much about the United States in this class, but this is, of course, one of the parts of Asia that is most connected to the United States. American involvement is mostly based on trade. We have a pepper trade established in the late 18th century. And this is the first importing of Southeast Asian spices into the United States. But that's kind of the extent of American involvement at the time. In the late 18th century, the United States was a very young nation, and it wasn't really building a colonial empire in the Pacific at this time. After 1850, we see that the pace of European colonization and the expansion of European influence in Southeast Asia is going to increase again. And this is a legacy of the Second Industrial Revolution. Second Industrial Revolution is connected to or is characterized by the production of steel and the use of oil. It's an increased mechanization and a faster mechanization, and we especially see its effects in conflict. And now you start to see European armies with technology that means they are far superior to the armies of non-industrialized nations in the world. And this means that most of the entire region of Southeast Asia is going to fall under European rule. Only Thailand, which on this map is marked as Siam, is going to remain independent. It's the only region of Southeast Asia that's going to remain under indigenous Asian rule. And even Thailand adopts these reforms called the Mothon reforms, which is a system of administrative subdivisions, the creation of a centralized government that means that Thailand, or the Kingdom of Siam, is an increasingly Western-looking state. It's adopted a lot of Western ideas. Again, thinking about this from the perspective of how do these regions interact with European influence and European ideas. It's an adoption of European practices by a country that's remaining politically independent. But for the rest of Southeast Asia, we see British conquests of Burma here, of Malaya, and of Borneo, the areas in yellow. French gain control of Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, and the Dutch remain in control of the islands of the East Indies. In 1896, we see the first Southeast Asian rebellion against European rule, and it's the Philippines who rebel against Spanish rule of the region. Now, the Spanish Empire had certainly been in decline for a long time during this period. And the United States is going to fight and defeat the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, as part of which of this conflict, the Spanish lose control of the Philippines. However, after the United States is successful, they seize control of the Philippines, and they are going to rule and govern the Philippines for the next 50 years. So Philippine independence doesn't occur. Even though the Philippines have successfully rebelled against Spanish rule, they are now going to be governed by the United States. And this is the rise of American influence in Southeast Asia. During this period of the history of early modern Asia, which, as I say, is characterized by the rise of European influence, we see some significant advantages gained by the region, even at the same time as this region is obviously being exploited and its resources used to benefit the colonizing powers. We see modernizations in agriculture and in mining that make the region more wealthy. We see the adoption of modern government practices in state bureaucracy, but we also see modern education and legal practices, the adoption of or the introduction of Christianity and other Western philosophies and ideas that are introduced to the region at this time. I'm going to end this video here. I'm going to come back with one more video that's going to talk about the history of Southeast Asia in the 20th century.